Anakin Skywalker's fateful choices during the final days of the Republic are pivotal to understanding how the galaxy descended into tyranny under the Galactic Empire. But what if, in a moment of clarity or defiance, Anakin killed Palpatine instead of joining him? The scenario raises a compelling question: how would Anakin, a Jedi Knight untrained in politics and governance, manage the Republic's transformation into an empire? At first glance, the idea of Anakin seizing power after Palpatine's death seems plausible. He was the chosen one, a figure prophesied to bring balance to the Force, and his extraordinary strength made him one of the most feared and revered individuals in the galaxy. Yet power is not solely about strength. Ruling requires legitimacy, strategy, and the delicate art of manipulation skills Palpatine wielded masterfully over decades. Anakin, for all his talents, lacked the political acumen and experience necessary to navigate the treacherous waters of governance. His rise to power in the absence of Palpatine would be fraught with challenges, beginning with the immediate aftermath of the Supreme Chancellor's death. The moment Anakin strikes down Palpatine, chaos would erupt. Palpatine had engineered a galactic war and concentrated immense power in his hands under the guise of safeguarding the Republic. His death would not immediately unravel the structures he built, but it would create a vacuum of authority. The Senate, cowed and complicit in his rise, would demand explanations. Palpatine's inner circle advisors, military leaders, and Sith loyalists would seek to protect their own interests. Without the shadow of Darth Sidious orchestrating events, Anakin would be thrust into the spotlight, and his every action would be scrutinized. Anakin's first challenge would be the legitimacy of his claim to leadership. He was a war hero, yes, but a Jedi, not a politician. The Jedi Order had distanced itself from political maneuvering, adhering to its role as peacekeepers rather than rulers. By killing Palpatine, Anakin might be seen as a traitor to both the Republic and the Jedi. After all, Palpatine was the elected leader, granted emergency powers by the Senate. How could a Jedi justify executing him without trial? Even if Anakin revealed Palpatine's identity as Darth Sidious, the Sith Lord responsible for the Clone Wars, his actions would still raise questions. Why hadn't the Jedi exposed Palpatine sooner? Was Anakin acting alone, or was this a coup orchestrated by the Jedi Council? The Senate, a body of self-serving politicians with varying loyalties, would likely fracture in response. Some would see Anakin as a savior who liberated the Republic from tyranny. Others would view him as a usurper, a Jedi who overstepped his authority. Factions would emerge, each vying for control. The remnants of the separatist movement, though leaderless without Count Dooku, could seize the opportunity to regroup, arguing that the Republic's corruption ran even deeper than they imagined. Meanwhile, loyalists to Palpatine, those who benefited from his regime, might rally to preserve his vision, painting Anakin as a murderer who betrayed the Republic at its most vulnerable moment. Anakin's second obstacle would be the Jedi Order itself. The Order's survival after Palpatine's death would depend on whether Anakin acted before or after the execution of Order 66. If the Jedi were already decimated, Anakin's position would be even more precarious. Without the backing of the Jedi Council, he would have no institutional support to legitimize his actions. If, however, he struck down Palpatine before the Order's destruction, he might seek the Council's endorsement. Yet the Jedi would be wary of Anakin's growing power and his unorthodox methods. His close relationship with Palpatine had already sown seeds of distrust. The Council might see his seizure of power as a dangerous concentration of authority in one individual, ironically echoing the very path that led to Palpatine's rise. Even if Anakin could convince the Senate and the Jedi that his actions were justified, his ability to transform the Republic into an empire would face logistical and ideological hurdles. Palpatine's strength lay in his ability to manipulate institutions and individuals, bending them to his will without overtly breaking them. He created the illusion of continuity, presenting the Galactic Empire as the natural evolution of the Republic. Anakin, by contrast, was a blunt instrument. His impulsive nature and lack of political finesse would alienate potential allies. He might attempt to use fear and intimidation to consolidate power, leveraging his prowess in the Force and his reputation as a warrior. However, ruling through fear alone is a precarious strategy, one that breeds resentment and rebellion. Anakin's temperament would further complicate his rule. Palpatine's calm, calculated demeanor allowed him to navigate political intrigue with ease. Anakin, on the other hand, was prone to emotional outbursts and struggled with inner conflict. His inability to manage his emotions would make him vulnerable to manipulation by those seeking to exploit his weaknesses. Advisors and military leaders might feign loyalty while secretly undermining him. The Senate could bog him down in endless debates and bureaucracy, exploiting his impatience and lack of political knowledge to delay or derail his initiatives. Moreover, Anakin's vision for the galaxy would likely lack the coherence and appeal of Palpatine's imperial narrative. Palpatine framed the transition from Republic to Empire as a necessary step to ensure peace and stability. He manipulated fear of the Separatists and the Jedi to justify his actions. Without Palpatine's charisma and strategic foresight, Anakin would struggle to craft a compelling narrative to unite the galaxy under his rule. His vision, if he even had one, would likely be reactionary rather than proactive, driven by his personal desire for order and control, rather than a clear political ideology. The military, a key pillar of Palpatine's empire, would pose another challenge. The clone army, bred for loyalty and obedience, might initially follow Anakin. But loyalty to a commander in the field does not necessarily translate to political allegiance. The chain of command, deeply intertwined with Palpatine's authority, would be disrupted. Anakin would need to assert control over the military hierarchy, ensuring their loyalty while preventing potential power struggles among ambitious officers. Additionally, the logistical and operational demands of governing a galaxy-spanning empire would strain even a seasoned leader. For Anakin, who had no experience in governance or administration, these demands could prove overwhelming. Despite his immense power and combat prowess, Anakin's lack of political legitimacy, strategic vision, and administrative expertise would make it exceedingly difficult for him to transform the Republic into a stable empire. His impulsive nature and reliance on force over diplomacy would alienate key allies and sow the seeds of dissent. In the end, Anakin might find himself isolated, beset by enemies both within and outside the Republic. The very power he sought to wield could become his undoing, as the weight of ruling a fractured galaxy proved too great for even the chosen one to bear. As Anakin grapples with the immediate chaos following Palpatine's death, the broader challenges of sustaining control over a galaxy-wide government begin to crystallize. In his mind, the Republic's transformation into an empire might seem like the most efficient way to enforce order, but implementing such a radical shift is easier said than done. Where Palpatine succeeded through manipulation and foresight, Anakin would face an uphill battle in every facet of governance, from securing loyalty to quelling dissent. The Senate would remain a major obstacle. Comprising thousands of representatives from countless star systems, the Senate was designed to be a forum for diverse voices and perspectives. However, its inefficiency and corruption made it susceptible to Palpatine's schemes. Anakin, in contrast, would find little success in navigating its labyrinthine politics. His straightforward, action-oriented nature would clash with the slow, procedural methods of governance. Senators with vested interests would seize on Anakin's lack of political experience, exploiting procedural delays and fostering alliances against him. They could argue that without Palpatine's guiding hand, the Republic should revert to its previous democratic structure, thereby challenging Anakin's attempts to consolidate power. Furthermore, Anakin's lack of political legitimacy would extend beyond the Senate. The galaxy at large would view him with suspicion. To the average citizen, the sudden death of the Supreme Chancellor at the hands of a Jedi could look like a coup. The Jedi were already viewed with a mix of awe and mistrust, seen as aloof enforcers of an outdated order. If Anakin tried to justify his actions by exposing Palpatine's identity as a Sith Lord, he would face skepticism. After all, few outside the Jedi Order truly understood or believed in the Sith, and even fewer would care about esoteric Force-related conflicts when their livelihoods were at stake. The transition from Republic to Empire required more than just a shift in governance. It demanded the buy-in of the galaxy's key power brokers. Palpatine achieved this by positioning himself as a unifying figure, using fear of external threats to rally support. Anakin, however, would struggle to present himself in the same light. His reputation as a military hero would not automatically translate to political authority. Unlike Palpatine, who carefully cultivated an image of benevolence and necessity, Anakin's leadership style would be perceived as authoritarian and impulsive. He lacked the subtlety to build consensus, instead relying on brute strength and intimidation tools ill-suited for the complex task of governance. The military, a cornerstone of Palpatine's empire, would be another significant hurdle. Although Anakin held the respect of many clones as a general during the Clone Wars, their allegiance was ultimately programmed to serve the Republic, and by extension, Palpatine. Without Palpatine's direct influence, the clones' loyalty could waver, particularly if Anakin's leadership style alienated key commanders. More critically, Anakin would need to secure the cooperation of non-clone military leaders, including admirals and governors who had risen through the ranks under Palpatine's regime. These individuals, accustomed to Palpatine's calculated leadership, would question Anakin's authority and capability to lead. Anakin's propensity for using the Force to assert dominance would only exacerbate these challenges. While his power might intimidate or coerce obedience in the short term, it would breed resentment over time. Those who felt forced into submission would quietly plot against him, forming resistance movements or aligning with rival factions. Moreover, the use of the Force as a political tool would deepen public mistrust. The galaxy had long harbored fears of the Jedi as potential tyrants, a sentiment Palpatine cleverly exploited in his propaganda. Anakin's visible use of power would play into these fears, undermining any attempt to portray himself as a just and fair ruler. Compounding these difficulties would be Anakin's personal instability. His internal conflict, which led him down a dark path in the first place, would not simply vanish with Palpatine's death. If anything, the pressures of leadership would exacerbate his insecurities and emotional volatility. His fear of losing control both of the galaxy and of his personal life would drive him to increasingly desperate measures. He might adopt draconian policies, imposing martial law and curbing civil liberties under the guise of maintaining order. Such actions would not only alienate the populace but also galvanize opposition movements. The Jedi, assuming any of them survived Order 66, would pose yet another challenge. Even if Anakin sought to position himself as a unifying figure within the Order, his past actions and close association with Palpatine would cast a long shadow. The Council, wary of his unchecked power, might view him as a threat rather than an ally. They could seek to undermine him, either through political maneuvering or direct confrontation. This tension would further erode Anakin's ability to project a stable and unified leadership. Perhaps most critically, Anakin's vision for the galaxy would lack the coherence necessary to sustain an empire. Palpatine's empire was built on a foundation of calculated rhetoric, presenting itself as the ultimate guarantor of peace and security. By contrast, Anakin's motivations were deeply personal, driven by his fears and desires rather than a well-defined political ideology. His decisions would be reactive, shaped by immediate crises rather than long-term strategy. This lack of vision would leave his regime vulnerable to internal dissent and external threats, as he failed to inspire the kind of loyalty and unity that Palpatine had so carefully cultivated. Without a strong, unifying narrative, Anakin's attempts to consolidate power would falter. Resistance movements would spring up across the galaxy, fueled by a mix of ideological opposition and practical grievances. Former separatists, disillusioned senators, and disaffected military leaders could all find common cause in opposing Anakin's rule. Even within the core worlds, the seat of galactic power, unrest would simmer. Citizens who once looked to the Republic for stability would now see an unstable regime led by a man more adept at wielding a lightsaber than navigating the complexities of governance. As Anakin's grip on power weakened, he would face the same fate as any ruler who relies solely on force to maintain control. Rebellion. The very systems and structures that Palpatine used to centralize power would become instruments of resistance against Anakin. The Senate, emboldened by his failures, might attempt to reassert its authority, while regional governors could seize the opportunity to declare independence. The military, divided in its loyalties, could splinter, with factions emerging to either support or oppose Anakin's rule. Ultimately, Anakin's downfall would be the result of his fundamental misunderstanding of power. While he possessed unparalleled strength in the Force and the loyalty of many on the battlefield, these assets alone could not sustain a government. True power lies in the ability to inspire, to unify, and to build systems that outlast the individual. Anakin, for all his might, lacked these qualities. His reign, if it ever truly began, would collapse under the weight of its contradictions, leaving the galaxy once again in turmoil. As Anakin's regime begins to falter, the cracks in his foundation would become more apparent. The galaxy, already fractured by years of war, would see his leadership as a continuation of the instability that plagued the Republic. Without Palpatine's political cunning to guide the transition, the Republic would not seamlessly evolve into an empire. Instead, it would become a patchwork of competing interests, each vying for power in the absence of clear and legitimate authority. One of the most immediate and significant challenges Anakin would face is the perception of his rule as illegitimate. Palpatine rose to power under the guise of legality, using the Senate and public fear to consolidate his authority. Every decree, every act of consolidation was framed as a necessary measure for the safety and stability of the Republic. Anakin, on the other hand, would not have this veneer of legitimacy. Killing Palpatine, even with the justification of exposing him as a Sith, would be seen by many as an extrajudicial act, a violation of the Republic's legal framework. To the public, Anakin's actions could appear indistinguishable from a Jedi coup. The Jedi were already seen as an elite order, wielding powers that set them apart from ordinary beings. By unilaterally removing the Supreme Chancellor, Anakin would reinforce the narrative that the Jedi were dangerous and unaccountable. This perception could spark widespread distrust, not only toward Anakin but toward any Jedi who remained loyal to him. The galaxy's fear of Jedi overreach, cultivated by Palpatine's propaganda, would now work against Anakin. The Senate, far from being a passive entity, would likely seize upon this public sentiment. Senators, particularly those who had benefited under Palpatine's rule, would label Anakin as a usurper. They could rally under the banner of restoring democratic governance, even if their true aim was to reclaim lost power and influence. These senators would not act alone. They would likely form alliances with other powerful factions, including corporate entities like the Trade Federation and the Techno-Union, who had their own interests in shaping the galaxy's future. Anakin's response to this political opposition would further illustrate his limitations as a leader. Palpatine had the patience to manipulate his enemies, turning them against one another while consolidating his own power. Anakin, however, would lack the subtlety for such strategies. His instinct would be to confront opposition directly, using force if necessary. While this might succeed in the short term, it would alienate even those who might have been sympathetic to his cause. Repressive measures would deepen divisions, turning political rivals into active insurgents. Moreover, Anakin's understanding of governance would be hampered by his lack of experience and knowledge. As a Jedi and a soldier, his focus had always been on direct action, not the intricate workings of statecraft. The administrative machinery of the Republic, its bureaucracies, regional governors, and logistical networks would be foreign to him. Without a trusted circle of advisors, Anakin would struggle to maintain the day-to-day operations of a galactic government. Even with his formidable power in the Force, he could not be everywhere at once, nor could he manage every crisis personally. This gap in administrative capability would create opportunities for rivals to undermine his rule. Regional governors, emboldened by the lack of centralized oversight, might begin to assert greater autonomy. Some could openly rebel, declaring their systems independent from Anakin's authority. Others might subtly resist, withholding resources or dragging their feet on implementing his directives. The more Anakin tried to enforce compliance through military means, the more he would stretch his forces thin, leaving critical sectors vulnerable to unrest or invasion. The military itself would not be a monolith of support. The clone troopers, while loyal, were ultimately conditioned to serve the Republic, not any individual leader. With Palpatine gone and the legitimacy of the new regime in question, their allegiance could waver. The officer corps, composed of clones and non-clones alike, would be divided in their loyalties. Some might follow Anakin out of respect for his wartime leadership, while others would question his ability to govern. Ambitious officers could exploit this uncertainty, positioning themselves as alternatives to Anakin's rule. The galaxy's outer rim territories would be particularly challenging to control. These regions, already marginalized under the Republic, would see Anakin's regime as another iteration of Core-centric tyranny. Separatist sentiment, though weakened by the defeat of the Confederacy, would not have disappeared entirely. Former separatist leaders and sympathizers could rally these disaffected systems, presenting themselves as the true defenders of their autonomy. Anakin, with his limited diplomatic skills, would struggle to win these systems over. His likely response, military suppression, would only reinforce their resistance. At the same time, the Jedi Order's remnants, if any survived, would find themselves in a precarious position. Some Jedi might rally to Anakin, believing that his power was necessary to bring order to the galaxy. Others, however, would view him as a fallen figure, corrupted by his proximity to Palpatine and his embrace of authoritarian methods. This division within the Jedi would further weaken their influence, leaving Anakin without a unified source of support from his former allies. Anakin's personal life would also complicate his ability to lead. His attachment to Padme and his children, while a source of strength, would also be a vulnerability. His fear of losing them, which had already driven many of his decisions, would now shape his approach to governance. He might seek to create a stable and secure galaxy as a means of protecting his family, but this goal would clash with the realities of ruling a fragmented and resistant galaxy. The more he tried to impose his vision of order, the more he would provoke opposition, endangering the very people he sought to protect. Over time, the pressures of leadership and the constant challenges to his authority would take a toll on Anakin. His reliance on fear and force would isolate him, creating a feedback loop of increasing paranoia and authoritarianism. As dissent grew, he would become more ruthless, believing that only through absolute control could he maintain stability. This path, however, would only lead to further instability, as resistance movements gained strength and legitimacy in the eyes of the galaxy. In the end, Anakin's rule would likely collapse under its own weight. Without the political legitimacy, administrative expertise, and strategic vision that Palpatine possessed, Anakin would be unable to sustain an empire. His reliance on force and fear would alienate allies and galvanize enemies, leading to widespread rebellion and fragmentation. The Republic, far from being transformed into a lasting empire, would fall into chaos, leaving the galaxy to once again grapple with the question of how to achieve lasting peace and stability.